Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is D back again with MKD58 Media, and I've got another movie review for you guys. And this movie review is for the 1990 thriller Pacific Heights. All right, now Pacific Heights, this is directed by John Schlesinger, and it is starring Matthew Modine, Melanie Griffin, and Michael Keaton. And what this movie is basically about, Matthew Modine and Melanie Griffin play Drake and Patty, this yuppie couple, unmarried, that purchased this home in San Francisco, and they actually fudge the numbers to make it so that they can financially, on paper, be able to afford and be accepted for this home. So they're really tight on money with this home. So what they have to do, it's imperative that they rent out the two units in the lower floor of the apartment. They rent those out. They have to rent these out in order for them to actually be able to afford the mortgage on this home. So they're under a lot of pressure actually from the offset. They end up renting one of the units out to this, nice kind of older couple. And then they try to rent out the second unit. They end up renting it, or at least planning on renting it, to Michael Keaton. And there's a lot of other suitors in line for this building, but Michael Keaton shows up prepared to pay 6 months rent in advance in cash. He's in his nice little Porsche, and Matthew Modine, he knows in the back of his head he's under pressure to make sure this home is able to get paid for. So a guy showing up willing to pay 6 months rent in advance and seemingly looking like he has a lot of cash at his disposal is tempting for Matthew Modine. And so what he goes ahead and skips the whole background check, the whole the whole renter's application check process you're supposed to go to when you're renting space out to a potential tenant. Michael Keaton gets him to kind of forego that whole process, and once that happens, Michael Keaton basically is able to move himself into this unit without actually fulfilling any type of background check and without actually making any type of financial payment. In the beginning, he told Matthew Modine's character Drake that he was going to wire transfer 6 months advance rent and things like that. He actually doesn't do that, but moves into the unit anyways, changes the locks, and basically becomes a tenant from hell, a tenant that will not leave. And it turns out he's basically a con artist who's trying to swindle this couple out of their home, and it's basically what he does for a living, pretty much, is try to move into units. And because of the way the laws work and stuff like that, you can't just throw him out onto the street. And he knows this. He knows how the laws work, and he knows this better than even this couple does. And it's what gets them into a stressful situation. And it's essentially, it's basically a case of a seemingly normal person turning out to be a psychopath. Okay. Now, what I thought about this movie, it has its moments, but it is not, in my opinion, it's hard for me to view it as a good movie, but it's not necessarily a bad movie. It just wasn't doing anything for me, and it had too much, there were too many frustrating scenarios going on for me to truly enjoy the film. And its subject matter is a little kind of normal-ish in a way, and that seems weird to say, but I mean, when you're coming off, I'm seeing movies where there's these kind of extraordinary, dire circumstances, and then you go to this movie, which is basically a movie about a bad tenant. Like, that's the kind of simple description of this movie. But then things start to happen, and then you start to put yourselves in the shoes of this couple who's trying to rent this home out, and then you start to think about the financial pressures that they're under, and then the movie starts to escalate in terms of how kind of over the top Michael Keaton's antics become, and how, not how safe to dangerous the transition is, from things being relatively safe and just kind of weird to them transitioning to being outright dangerous and life-threatening. And then you start to kind of see the real underlying seriousness of this situation. But it does come off as being a movie that's almost like a made-for-TV style film, where a lot of times movies that are made for TV, I remember especially back in the 90s, back in the day, they would feel like the stakes aren't quite as high as a lot of the big time theatrical release type films. And maybe that's just a kind of a bias, an internal bias. I don't know what it is, but that's kind of how this movie starts to feel. Like it's really like, oh, this isn't really quite as serious as maybe, you know, you would think it is, but it actually turns out to be fairly serious. The two main positives about this movie, Michael Keaton's performance and some of the camera work, some of the camera moves and camera work was actually pretty impressive in this movie. Sometimes there were camera things going on that I felt like was above the grade of the actual film. Like this, whoever this cinematographer is, he clearly wants to work on more ambitious projects, you know, but he's deciding to use some of his skills on this little movie or whatever. So the camera work was impressive in moments. Michael Keaton, like I said, I forget how villainous he can be because I always think of him as Batman. So my initial grouping of him is in the good guy category, but then you really start to look at things, and he's a very villainous actor. To me, Beetlejuice was a villain. You know, people kind of love him and all that type of stuff, but technically he was a villain. Then you look at this movie, and then you look at something like Desperate Measures, the movie he did with Andy Garcia. I didn't see that movie in its entirety, but I, know enough about the characters and plot and things like that to where, okay, he's a villain in that movie and a pretty good one. And then, of course, Vulture in the recent Spider-Man films. He's a villain in those. So you have these at least 4 examples of him being a menacing, true-to-form villain. And then I start to really look at, Michael Keaton, his face, the makeup of his face is like, he looks like a villain. He has those super archy, diabolical eyebrows. And then his smile, when mixed with his eyebrows, it almost comes off like a sneer, in a way. And he has these really expressive eyes. If he wants to look kind of outraged, he's really good at that. And it started to dawn on me, like, he could really be a better villain than a hero, actually, even though his most famous role is a heroic role, you know what I mean? So I thought that was an interesting thing. It was interesting watching Michael Keaton play such a diabolical, psychotic bad guy, especially when you view him mostly as Batman. So that was a kind of an interesting thing. The negatives about this movie, though, the two main characters, the two protagonists, Melanie Griffith and Matthew Modine's characters, were just extremely naive, especially Matthew Modine's character. He was constantly frustrating. He was leading with his emotions all the time, which when watching movies, especially these type of scenarios where somebody is going against somebody who's smart and diabolical, if that protagonist is just overly emotional, it's going to be frustrating to watch because the smart, diabolical one is just going to constantly get the best of them over and over. And that's what happens in large portions of this film. Matthew Modine gets constantly outsmarted by Michael Keaton because Michael Keaton's character knows the law, knows how rental situations work. He just knows how to kind of operate within this space, and Matthew Modine is just a total kind of novice to so many factors, be it how the law in general works regarding assault and things like that, and how the law works regarding property issues and tenants and evictions and all that type of stuff. He just is so ignorant to all of it that he is just easy prey for Michael Keaton's character in this movie, and it's just very frustrating to watch. Now, granted, Matthew Modine and Melanie Griffin's characters are supposed to be young, and by proxy, I'm assuming they're supposed to be inexperienced and naive and all those type of things. So there is that, they kind of get that pass, because when I was the age that I'm assuming they're supposed to be in this movie, meaning early 20s, I made a lot of dumb mistakes, did a lot of oversight on things, made mistakes where I tried to skip steps in certain situations, and then it bit me in the ass later on, as it does to Matthew Modine, because in the whole application process at the beginning of this movie, he skips steps because he wants to make sure financially things are secured, and that kind of bites him in the ass. So, but it's frustrating to watch. It's really a movie where you're watching people make mistake after mistake after mistake, and that's always going to be a frustrating watch. So yeah, that negative factor, or those negative factors of this movie just really affected how much I enjoyed this movie. My score for this film, I'm actually going to go 5 out of 10 for this movie. I do feel this is a movie, there's people out there that will really like it. There's people out there that will just get a kick out of it, enjoy it, understand it. I mean, if you're a landlord, the movie might speak to you. I would actually recommend this movie to anybody who is a landlord or is like looking to get into being a landlord and property ownership, property management, and things like that, because for those folks, at the very least, it'll put a level of fear in you that you'll pay attention to how you do business and who you accept into your building, and whether or not you skip application steps and all those type of things. This movie might be good for kind of putting a little fear in you to make you kind of do things the right way when it comes to dealing with tenants and things like that. So I would recommend this for people that are looking to get into property ownership. But other than that, the movie just really didn't do anything for me. So for the purposes of keeping this review as short as possible, 5 out of 10 for Pacific Heights. I do actually kind of recommend it if you've just never heard of this movie and you're a fan of Michael Keaton, and or you're a fan of those mid to early 90s films where there's a whole lot of them. Those 90s films where seemingly normal people turn out to be psychos. If you're a fan of those type of movies, this actually probably will do something for you. So I'm talking about things like The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, Fatal Attraction, Unlawful Entry with Ray Liotta and Kurt Russell, something like what was the other one I was going to mention? I guess Single White Female. There's a whole lot of these movies that came out in the 90s. So if you're a fan of any of that type of stuff, this probably will do something for you. So I do recommend it in that case. Otherwise, that's it, you guys. 5 out of 10 for Pacific Heights. That's it. As usual, I will catch you on the next go round.